Well, so this module is focused on HCI Mesh. Primarily, it's referred as vSAN HCI Mesh. Again, it's having only one lesson. Then key objective just to understand the purpose of HCI Mesh, review the HCI Mesh topologies. There's two way of deploying HCI Mesh cluster in active or kind of one service kind of master, active and passive. Active and passive, when we say the one cluster, where we'll enable the, I mean, which will be having one kind of vSAN data store can be shared among multiple standby clusters. When we say the passive, they will not be having kind of vSAN data store. They'll be leveraging the vSAN data store only from one cluster. Okay. And explore remote vSAN data store operations. Still, we have some limitations like with vSAN data store operation or remote data store. We'll talk about. So when we say vSAN HCI mesh, it means is something we are sharing the vSAN data store. Okay, and we are making that enable to access this vSAN data store from different another clusters. For an example here, this is one vSAN cluster. It's a local vSAN data store, and we could see these are vSphere client clusters. vSphere client doesn't mean your actual vSphere client. It's kind of client cluster, right? They are leveraging their local data store. Along with it, they are leveraging the remote vSAN data store as well. Just in a use case, kind of, we just made 4-node cluster. We are lacking with the storage. We don't have sufficient storage to be available here. So we can leverage this remote vSAN data store. It's more over like we just access the remote SAN, right? In remote SAN, we can request to the multiple SAN LANs. We can achieve that. So what VMware try to do, like if we have the nodes does not have sufficient storage capacity, and another cluster where we have the mass storage capacity in that particular vSAN data store, we can access that remotely and we can leverage that, and we can tickle down the VMs from here to here, kind of VM storage, VM virtual machine storage motion, right? So as a workload scale, it could be become storage and compute constraint. That's what we talked about. Another cluster might have an excessive storage that can be leveraged by another clusters. So second topology is, it's not topology actually, it's just again a feature. Multiple independent vSAN clusters for native cross-cluster architecture allow traditional vSphere vSAN clusters to remotely access to another and optimize the use of vSAN environment at its scale, right? So the previous topology, what we have seen, like there is one cluster which is being as kind of a master, we could say slave or a server or a client, kind of that. From here, it's just only this data store can be leveraged by this cluster, again separate cluster. It's not a unidirectional, it could be bidirectional as well. We'll have two clusters if we want to make some availability of this data store remotely to this one, like this, locally for this, remote for this. Same way, local for this and remote for this. Okay, so it's all together possible. So cluster is one of the storage capacity, like here, just an use case where my cluster one have approximately 90% have been storage utilized, but I could see compute is enough available. I am able to provision more VMs from compute perspective, but storage perspective, I don't have sufficient space. So this remote data store, what I could see the possibilities, yeah, another cluster I don't have, still sufficient storage available. Let me leverage it instead of adding new nodes, expensing too much amount. So I can mount it as a remote data store. Okay. So Client cluster, a client cluster can be a vSphere or vSAN. Initiate the connection, a unidirectional connection to the server cluster, mount and consume the storage. Do we require additional license? No. Server cluster must be a vSAN, requires license with vSAN HCI Mesh feature. vSAN HCI Mesh feature, especially for Enterprise Plus cluster, supports the bidirectional connections to other vSAN cluster. When we say bidirectional, it means is like, it's not only like this would be server, this would be client at the another moment where I feel like this have the excessive storage, it could be server, it could be client as well, right? They're the same topology we talked here. Correct. Storage only, like again, where we talk about spoke and hub kind of that situation, and it is just the topology one where we referred as it's an one vSAN data store can be further leveraged by multiple another vSphere cluster as an remote vSAN data store. So one important thing here is, can we see the local data store this time? No, we are not seeing, right?
No, sir.
We are only utilizing the remote vSAN data store. It means that is, if you want to create a vSAN cluster, and ideally on the hosts, I don't have the storage capability or storage disk, especially for vSAN data store, I can make a vSAN cluster still without any local data store. Okay. That point of time, I'll create it, and later on, I can mount the remote vSAN data store. So it means that simply I can use compute only cluster, and later on I can mount the vSAN data store from the remote vSAN cluster. Correct. So this is ideal for greenfield environment or a diskless servers. Okay. Consolidation of VM storage, saving the vSAN license cost. Absolutely. Like here, I don't need to leverage any vSAN license. I am only leveraging the ESX hypervisor license, right? But definitely I should take like some of the heavy disk or the amount of, the total disk I can leverage it kind of vSAN data store. Cross cluster topology that we talked about, like kind of it's not unidirectional, it's bidirectional, that what we said, like I can share something from here to this and to this. Correct. I can share something directly between this and this, something directly between and this. It's possible, right? That's what it's trying to say. It's not a kind of unidirectional. I can use the remote vSAN cluster from any to any. Get my point? If at the moment it is sharing something, it can receive something too, right? Same way at the moment it's giving some vSAN data store, it can take some vSAN data store also. Correct? So the minimum requirement, what we say, client cluster can mount up to maximum 10 remote vSAN data store. It's good. A server cluster can serve its data store to a max of 5 client clusters. Maximum, how many? 5 client cluster. Total within the entire mesh, within the entire topology where we are leveraging the remote one, total of 120 hosts can be accessed the server cluster. Means is that if I refer it as only my server, doesn't mean air compute. Server cluster means here server cluster which is serving the vSAN data store. So how many total? Total means is like if it's have total 24, total 64, it's leveraging it, it's a local. Okay, then rest of 64, like 32 from here and 32 from here. HCI mesh include, I mean, can leverage for hybrid and HCI mesh. Latency between remote cluster and local cluster should be less than 5 millisecond. Ideally, it should be very, very much less. We referred as remote vSAN cluster only for the local side. That's an important point. 25 GB or higher recommended network dedicated, and it support both layer 2 and layer 3 network. I mean, how I have designed my vSAN traffic, it's over L2 or over L3, right? You'll ask me like, sir, do we need to create separate VM kernel? How it's getting it? It's purely over network communication channel. Unsupported configuration, definitely it's not for a stretch cluster, not for 2 node, not for kind of cloud native storage where we have deployed Tanzu cluster and all. That's an important point. We should not enable vSAN data in transit, RDMA enable cluster, and VM is spanning multiple data store, VMDK1 on VMFS, VMDK2 on a remote vSAN data store. That's not possible. Either my all VMDK should be on my vSAN data store, or either my all VMDK should be my VMFS data store. But the important thing need to know here is, sir, I have a cluster where I was earlier leveraging the SAN, remote SAN. Okay. And I was having the SAN storage. Okay. Now I brought up a vSAN cluster, and under this I have a huge amount, like for an example, 1000 TB of vSAN data store. Now, however, it's a reverse use case, but still, can I use this vSAN data storage in remote? Answer is absolutely yes. These hosts should fulfill the vSAN requirement. We have to create vSAN VM kernel, everything is there. Enable the vSAN cluster feature and mount the remote vSAN data store here. Okay, then you can flip-flop the VMs between this traditional SAN data store and your vSAN data store. You can do the storage vMotion across the different flavors of your data store. Either it was a VMFS that you have achieved from traditional SAN, or either it was a NFS data store. That hybrid mechanism is also possible altogether. Or somewhere you are planning just to move from native SAN to vSAN based SAN, okay, then you can also make it as a use case. Just add the remote vSAN cluster, move the VMs in remote vSAN cluster. Later on, just onboard some of the disk locally and create a local vSAN data store along with this remote one. And then move the VMs from remote vSAN data store to local. It's altogether possible, right? So it means that end of the day, within a single vSAN cluster, you can leverage 2 vSAN data store. One is your local and one is your remote, right? So when we say server to client cluster configuration, a client cluster can either be a vSphere cluster, okay, a native vSphere cluster, the one which we're talking about here, right? And a already vSAN enabled cluster. The client determine the requirement. HA need to be turned off for the moment you are enabling the vSAN. For that, on each host, a vSAN VM kernel port is required for vSAN communication to the server vSAN cluster. I mean, simply we do the vSAN VM kernel. Okay. So this vSAN VM kernel should talk to the vSAN network that you have configured on the server cluster side. Server means who will be serving the vSAN data store. HCI Mesh compute cluster configures at minimal service for vSAN. vSAN cluster, again, no additional setup required. What it means is, if my server cluster serving as a, which will be providing as a remote data store to another one, do I need to do some additional thing there? Nothing. No. On my server end, I don't need to do any configuration at all. We clear?
Yes, sir.
All right. So this is just one of the example where we are enabling a cluster. Okay. And during the cluster configuration, I am saying I don't need a local vSAN data store. Okay. So it means that configure cluster. You remember when we were configuring the cluster one, right? There was tab. I don't need a local vSAN cluster. Configure a
Yes.
cluster without vSAN data store. So what it will do, it will make a compute only cluster. But when you go in data store side, there wouldn't be any data store, right? But right later on, what I can do, I'll go in a local cluster and in vSAN cluster, I will choose mount the remote data store. Okay, mount the remote data store. Then it will show you the feasible remote data store with the respective another cluster. Okay, but again, what I say, my native vSAN requirement should be fulfilled. When I say native requirement, my vSAN kernel should be available there. Okay, and the primary and important thing is here, both the clusters should be part of same vCenter server. That's an important thing, right? Both the cluster should be part of same vCenter server. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see remote cluster. You'll be finding here how I will find the cluster that is hosted on another vCenter, right? So a common vCenter should be there, and my preference to go with the common VDS as well. Okay, and use the common vSAN port group for creating the vSAN VM case for each and every host in the different clusters, right? However, there could be another VDS, but that point of time, my vSAN traffic should talk with each other. So once you will do mount, it will show you the mount, and these are my compatibility and validation. Remote data store type is vSAN. Server and client cluster are from the same data center. It should be from, that's the point, same data center. Selected server cluster. Its image is bit blur. Okay, please bear with me. Cluster configuration is supported. All host. So automatically in the validation, if something is missing, it will show you, yeah, no, we cannot go beyond that. The validation is not successful. Okay. Then you will find just an data store, kind of remote data store, but only the things like whatever the VM is active where cluster, those will be active where, right? It's not like that. Like you come on a second cluster and you will start to managing the VMs from your remote cluster. That's not possible, right? Because the compute itself is occupying on another, right? The simple thing, like I have one set of cluster, I have another set of cluster. Okay, those are leveraging the common vSAN data store. For one of the cluster, it is a local, and for one of the cluster, it is a remote. Correct? But whatever VM being activated here, they can. Now, if you will ask me, sir, storage is at common place. That's a good thing, right? Storage is at common place, right? Can we use these VM migration also to make it more compatible and all? Yes, you can. Cross-cluster vMotion is possible. Only the thing, you have to use the common VDS for both of them. Correct? If you are using common VDS, from the common VDS, you are leveraging the common vMotion port group for them. Then it gives you the feasibility, because storage altogether is common for both of them. It gives you the feasibility to migrate the VMs from here to there as well, right? It's a kind of vMotion that point of time. So they are by name, those are cluster, but they are very close. They are very close brothers, right? Part of same family altogether, right? VMs listed as remote accessible and appear to the cluster. Yes, that's fine. Mount, unmount. Unmount is again a simple thing. Just if you'll do unmount, what will happen? It will unmount from the remote, correct? And all the VMs underlying storage, the VMs goes in the inaccessible state, unaccessible state actually from the remote cluster. But still my data will be safe on a remote vSAN data store. Still my VM data is safe, but I won't be able to access the VMs from the respective cluster from where we are unmounting this vSAN data store, right? Clear? So
Sir,
it's
we
again,
will.
we have to create a compute only cluster, configure that, mount it, disable data in transit. That's the important thing. We have to disable data in transit encryption, mount remote vSAN, migrate the VMs, okay, prepare, and that's all about the lab part that we are doing. But it's an interesting one, right? So
Yes, sir.
the key points what we took from here is we can mount the vSAN data store across the clusters, but the main thing should be the part of same data center. They should leverage common VDS, common vCenter server, and it's a kind of server to client architecture. It could be an active passive or it could be a active architecture also. We can make a mesh, okay? And the best use cases are only the one where we are lacking the storage, okay? We can leverage the remote vSAN data store. The one second use case where we want to do DC transformation from, we want to completely remove the external. So again, we can leverage the local vSAN data store or also vSAN remote vSAN data store for the moment if we don't have the sufficient local disk available, right? That's also, and we can do kind of active sharing. Okay. Probably active sharing is not the more useful because only the cluster will take the storage wherever it's lacking, right? And how many remote data store can be mounted? That's the important point, nah? So one cluster can beg from multiple clusters. That's a good thing, right? It's not only like you being as a client accessing the remote data store only from one cluster, right? You can leverage from multiple cluster, है ना? How many? 10, है ना? 10 remote data store can be mounted on a single cluster, okay? That's a good thing.
Yep.
And from one, if one server is serving, it can give to 5 clients because somewhere it have to maintain latency, data write and all, right? So it can give up to 5 clients. That's what, okay? And we have to, again, all the games, all the magic can be happen only within a single data center, not across the multiple data centers, right? That we can prepare something, we can do a good lab around. But I believe this is in VMware HOL itself covering, okay? So that's what about vSAN HCI Mesh, guys. And yeah, like people are asking a lot of questions around these technologies nowadays if you face any interview, right? But people know very high level, but yeah, if you'll touch little bit deep digger part on particular components, how it happened, what is mount, unmount and all, then definitely interviewer will be impressed from you. They'll say, yes, the guys know how to do work in that, right?
Yes, sir.
That's it from my side for today. And yeah, definitely we'll be performing all these HCI mesh, two node cluster, and the stretch one will be doing even within our single network. That's a fine, but at least we have to perform something, right?
Yes, sir.
So we are here today. Then 10 modules we have finished so far, 5 more remaining. If in between they'll allow to perform some labs, that would be good. But yeah, I think we have done 12th one also, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yeah, called. Today only called.
Yeah. So next, I'll prefer to go with ESA. That is something new feature. That's again an interesting thing to know about enterprise storage architecture, how it's different between the traditional storage, what we are using so far. You will get some more magic over there. That's a good thing. Troubleshooting, monitoring, maintenance. This all we'll do together. But before that, we will try to finish the file services, iSCSI storage, and the ESA architecture, right? And what I think of, what I believe of, like in upcoming days, people don't go with the traditional OSA one. They will refer to go with ESA one, because ESA one just tried to remove the all the limitations that we find kind of that the cache disk capacity separate together, disk group limitation. That's all being, I mean, pretty optimized in that way, and we don't have any limit to go to the storage size. We don't need to create the separate cache at all. So that's pretty interesting and magical, even in storage policies perspectives. A lot of things have been introduced with ESA. Again, it's a feature of vSAN 8 only. Okay, guys, that's it from my side. So, Banu, what I'll